Bending wood doesn't need to be hard, expensive, or take a lot of time, but I managed to tick all of those boxes in this build. In this video, I'll go over the things I did to make a project I've had in my head for quite some time. I'll tell you the 5 things I learned about steam bending, I'll be making a steam box, I'll talk about the extreme amounts of money I spent on just this project because of all the mistakes I made, and what I would do if I were to make this project again. This video is sponsored by PCBWay. I've always wanted to try to bend wood, but it seems like something only the really experienced woodworkers can do. But I really wanted to try it out. So I was aiming to do it as cheaply as possible. But still, there are some costs hard to get around. And eventually, it ended up costing me a lot more than I had planned. More about that later. In order to bend wood, I read a bunch of posts about it. I watched a ton of videos and I eventually ended up with a game plan. So what you need to bend wood with steam is something like this. Some kind of steam or heat source. And the easiest and cheapest solution to create steam that I could find was this inexpensive wallpaper removal thing. It was $50 on Amazon. I'll leave a link down below because that was one of the things that actually worked out for me. The second thing I needed was somewhere to put the wood and the steam inside of. So I was going to use a PVC pipe because we have a lot of them. But then a friend of mine said it would easily melt, so I searched through our garage and found this vent pipe that belongs to my father-in-law. So it was free, I guess. And when searching online, I found out that one of these are $17 for 2 meters. I also bought a vent lid to put on one end of it. But then I realized that that would probably release a lot of the heat straight through, so I decided to build a wooden box around it. And for that, I got some 15mm plywood. The next thing I added to the list is totally optional, but I wanted to know what the temperature was in the pipe whilst steaming, so I bought this thermometer. It was $10 on Amazon. The last thing I got that you might already have lying around was a sheet of MDF. I will use that to build the clamping jig for the wood once it comes out of the steamer. There's other stuff you might want, like some gloves that can take some heat, a bunch of clamps, obviously, and I guess patience. The first thing I did was to cut down a bunch of plywood to make up for the box to surround the vent pipe. I used 15mm plywood and I had it cut down to make a box that is a bit bigger than the pipe, and that is to be able to add some spray foam around the pipe. That way I will have a well-insulated vent pipe and probably a steam box that I can use for a long time. Or just a giant cigarette. This was a decision I took last minute, but oftentimes I just think I'm doing this as a one-time thing. But I realized that if I ever want to steam wood again, it would be good if I had a good steam box. And the other reason was that I was really scared of making a vent pipe steam box that wouldn't be enough to get a good temperature, and that would maybe cause a steam box that I would have to rebuild later on anyways. The plywood also makes it easier to attach dowels through the box later, and that is to make a shelf to put the wood on inside of the steamer. That's so that the wood won't just lie directly on the vent pipe. When all the plywood was cut, I started assembling 2 sides with glue and clamps, and when the glue had dried a bit, I could take the clamps off and drill some countersinks and then add some screws to hold it together. The screws might have been overkill here, but it was easier doing it this way than waiting for the glue to completely dry. And as the heat will probably loosen up some of the glue in the plywood, it feels better being on the safe side. Then I flipped it over and repeated the same steps for the other side. I didn't have a much bigger workshop before, but I'm really feeling limited by the size of the current workshop. Just putting something like this, a 2-meter long box together, means I have to move everything out of the way to be able to put it together, and also get a good shot of me doing it. Otherwise, it's hard making a video from it. To make sure the pipe will lay centered inside the box I'm building, I made a couple of rounded pieces that had the same shape as the pipe. I basically just traced the shape of the pipe and measured the width of the box and drew this up. I did cut it out on the bandsaw, and for reasons mentioned earlier about the size of the workshop, changing the blade on the bandsaw also becomes a bit of work where I need to move things around, so instead I had to cut with the resawing blade that was already in there. A bit harder, but it works. Then I came back and added screws to the second side of the wall, making it a 3-sided box. On the topic of a small workshop, I am planning to build a new one inside of a barn. It's going to be a really big project during this year, and I hope to be able to get it started as soon as possible, but I don't have a plan of what to show about the process just yet. So if there's any particular part of it that you're interested in, let me know so that I can include it. Then I could space out those newly made holders. I placed the vent pipe inside of the box to make sure the placement of the holders was good enough. And when pleased, I added some glue to the holders and glued them in place. To get the steam inside of the pipe, I drilled a hole in the vent pipe lid that I bought to accept a bushing that will connect to the steamer. The bushing, I guess, costs a bit of money as well, but I found that on the farm, so I have no idea. The connection on the steam pipe threading did fit perfectly. On the inside of the vent pipe lid, I added a nut to keep it in place. Then I attached the pipe lid to the pipe and placed the pipe in the box. The ends of the box needed some pieces cut as well, so I had them cut on the table saw. Then I marked out the center on one of the end pieces and drilled a hole for the bushing to be able to connect to the steamer hose. Notice that in this shot, on the topic of a small workshop again, I had to move the work table with the steam box out of the way, connect the table saw with a cable that runs all the way inside of our house. It's just a ton of work for the smallest things. I have a bunch of old Forstner bits that I inherited from my father. Unfortunately for me, most of them are really dull. So I wished for a set of Forstner bits for Christmas and received a really good set of Fisher Forstner bits. Looking at this, I realized this was my last time using the old ones. The hole is just to be able to attach the hose of the steamer to the bushing I attached previously. On the other side, I marked out the location for 2 hinges and drilled them in place. And this is where I'll put the wood inside of the pipe. I also added a locking mechanism to be able to fully lock the door when I'm steaming the wood. There are a ton of videos on YouTube about steam bending, and there were a couple of common advice I gathered from them. So here's my list of 5 things I learned about bending wood. 1. Wind-dried lumber is ideal, but you can make it work with kiln-dried wood as well, you just have to steam it a bit longer. 2. A common advice is to steam wood at an hour for every inch of thickness, but I never saw anyone that didn't fail without doing it a bit longer than that, so that was my plan to do as well. 3. A compression band seems to be a necessary piece of equipment not to fail. Because wood can't stretch, so when compressing the wood at the same time as bending it, you prevent the wood from cracking. 4. You also need wood with as straight grain as possible, otherwise it's gonna crack. 5. And lastly, make sure you get the temperature up as much as possible because it's actually the heat that makes the wood bendable. I used some spray foam to insulate the space around the vent pipe for reasons mentioned earlier. There was something oddly satisfying of cutting away the excess foam from the top. I think the saw I used for this is pretty much unusable after this, so I should probably add that to the list of expenses as well, but I won't. Collateral damage. With the foam flat, I could add glue and attach the last piece to finalize the steam box. But I also went a bit overboard with the design of the steamer. I asked ChatGPT for a steam logo, and it gave me a ton of train logos, but eventually I got something kind of good. So I engraved that onto a piece of brass coin with my fiber laser. I know, this is overboard. And then I had that countersunk down into a piece of black MDF, together with a thermometer I bought. So my steamer got some finesse, just for the fun of it. It's stupid, I know, but sometimes that makes the project more fun. Or it might have been the fact that I was looking for a way to postpone the terrifying bending part. I drilled a hole for the thermometer down into the vent pipe, and then I could attach the black MDF with some nice brass screws, which honestly is so unnecessary, but I liked it. It looks good and also makes it more clear to myself that this isn't some jig I'll just throw away. This is my steamer. The last part of the process was adding the dowels. I marked out where I wanted them, and then I made a small 3D printed jig to be able to drill the holes in the same height to be able to push the dowel through later. The hole marks the location where to drill, so it was just a matter of drilling through and try to stay as straight as possible. Lastly, I drilled a drain hole on the same side as the steam will go into the box. When steaming, you put the entire box in a slight tilt so that all the water in the steamer will pour out through this hole. When the steamer was finished, I got to work on the wood. For this project, I'm using birch. The main reason is that it's what I have, but also in contrast to popular opinions, I'm not too fond of dark furniture. That being dark wood. It's a matter of taste, I know. I checked my wood for pieces that would have the straightest grain, and then I got to work. The idea is to make a 40mm dowel that basically looks like it's split down the middle, and one of the split pieces bends out into a lamp. And to make that, I wanted two 20mm thick and 40mm wide pieces. That way, when I glue them together later, it will look like a dowel. I planed the pieces and I had them cut on the table saw and then milled them to the correct thickness. So in order to do this, you can see that my table saw is angled. I had to move it to be able to cut the 2-meter long pieces. I'm not too fond of moving my table saw around, but fortunately for me it has casters for this very reason, so it's quite easy sliding it around. So when reflecting on the choices I made for the placement of everything in the current workshop, I'm not sure I took the right decisions. When those pieces were cut, I had to move everything back in place, roll out the planer thicknesser, and take the pieces down to the final dimension. And I do get discouraged by all of this moving things around. When that was done, I was ready to start routing. I decided to make a groove to fit the cob LED I bought. Now, this would be a good time to talk about the LEDs and what I spent on buying different LEDs. The first set I bought was an RGB LED strip, and as it turns out, you can't cut that to size. I didn't know. So then I bought another LED strip. That strip could be cut, but I must have misread online as it looks like more of a neon strip and it was too thick to put in my wood. Then I bought another cheap strip that I was going to use, but then a friend recommended me to get cob LEDs for this types of lamps, so I got that. But when I shortened that, it started flickering. I don't know why, but I couldn't resolve it. That was the LED strip I planned on using all the way through this build, but ended up not being able to use it because of the flickering. So the last strip I bought ended up being only 1mm thick, so the groove that you'll see me make is way too deep for the LEDs that I finally ended up with. So all in all, I ended up spending $192 in total just on LEDs. What a shit show. I used the cheap router table I bought from Amazon to route the groove with a 15mm bit. The router table works okay, but it isn't ideal. So this project led me to a future project, making a really good router table. Or I should say, making the best router table I could think of. I'm already on my way to design it, but I would love to hear what functions you think the perfect router table should have. Let me know in the comments down below. I also routed a groove for a piece of acrylic that I could put above the LEDs to cover them up, and also to create a nice dampened glow. This was all a mistake, but I didn't know that at the time. After both grooves were cut, I was ready to create the roundover. It turned out that the router bit that I bought with a 20mm roundover did not fit the cheap router table. So I had to do this handheld with the palm router and the plunge accessory I have. And that was hard. I did it in small sections, trying to clamp support pieces around it as much as possible, and in the end I got what looked like a really good roundover with some minor mistakes that I could sand away later. Then I went on to make the bending form. I had bought 2 smaller pieces of shelving MDF for this, so I used that together with a bendy piece of threaded rod to get the shape I wanted onto the wood. That worked out good, and I had it bend a bit more than I wanted the end result to be, because there's always some spring back when you unclamp the bent wood. I taped the threaded rod onto the MDF to keep the shape of the bend. Then I just drew around that and I could cut that out on the bandsaw. But as you can see, I actually changed the bandsaw blade before doing this. Sometimes I apparently have the energy to do those kinds of things. I used the belt sander to remove any sand marks and to smooth it out. There's no need for this to be perfectly shaped, since I'm just using it to clamp the bent wood later. The MDF was 19mm thick, so I needed 2 pieces together to reach the thickness of, well, almost 40mm. So with a flush trim bit, I went on to make a duplicate of the first piece. And flush trimming MDF is not oddly satisfying at all. It creates so much dust, and before you say I wasn't using the dust collection on the router, no I didn't, because I'm lazy. I attached the MDF pieces to a piece of plywood so that I could clamp the entire length of the lamp. Once I had the form finished, I placed it onto the floor of my workshop and made sure it wouldn't move. To make the compression band, I tried hard to find a steel band. It wasn't easy, and the only thing I could find was this plumber's tape. But that came on a roll of 25 meters, and I only needed 2 meters. So that was $100 including shipping, which means I have a lot of that steel band left for other occasions. I used some scrap wood to cut the pieces for each side of the steel band. I put the steel band in between 2 parts of wood, where one of the pieces is pushed to the side, and that will hold the material I'm bending. Since the steel band had a bunch of holes in it, I used those holes for attaching the wood to the band with some machine screws and nuts. Then it was time to cut the acrylic to size. I measured the length of the groove I had routed out. Then I had the acrylic cut on the table saw. The acrylic is clear, but the plan is to sand it to give it that frosted look so that you won't see the LEDs underneath. With a radius gauge, I marked out where to round over the acrylic, and then I used the belt sander to get that rounded. And then I did a test fit of the acrylic and made sure it was the correct size. I didn't know this then, but this was a big mistake. Which was sad, because it was a perfect snug press fit. I also drilled a hole down through the groove, which will lead to the other piece that I'm not bending, so that I can feed the LEDs down through the dowel. Then I was ready to do the actual bending. I was dreading this part, because I've seen so many videos of people doing this, and many of them ended up with a crack in the first bend. This was also hard from a YouTuber aspect, because when the wood comes out of the steamer, you have about 90 seconds to do the actual bend. After that, the wood has cooled down enough that the risk of cracking gets bigger. And for that reason, I placed cameras all around my workshop. I had already placed the wood in the steamer, and since the wood was about 20mm thick, I had them in there for almost 2 hours. One of the reasons for the long steam was that my wood is kiln dried, so I doubled the time twice to make sure it got steamed enough. So it's only been running for a couple of minutes, but as you can see, there's a lot of steam coming out. I didn't drill any other steam access holes, because I think that's enough. But I'm a bit worried that that's going to make the entire workshop completely damp. But we'll see. We'll just have to wait and see. If it fails and the workshop is like moist all over, what have I got myself into? So I have everything set up. I've got the clamps ready. I decided to do this on my own. I've got a phone recording there. I've got a GoPro over there. Another phone over there. I'm gonna put my iPhone on here. Record straight down because I can't be bothered playing around with the cameras whilst getting it out of the steamer and clamping it down. And the steamer's been running for almost 2 hours, so I bet we're ready to take it out very soon. Since my form was firm on the floor and didn't move, I was able to bend the wood slowly with my leg whilst using my free hands to clamp down the wood. Otherwise, it is suggested to be 2 people on the job. And I succeeded, and I was thrilled to say the least. I think I have success. I think I have success. God damn it! Yes! Ha ha ha! Woo! I don't know if you can see, but that was the sweatiest moment of my life. But I'm so happy because I have no cracks. I have no cracks! First time steam bending. I have no cracks. Oh, look at this. Oh man. That looks so nice. After 2 full days in clamps, I unclamped the wood. As mentioned earlier, it flexed back a bit, but that was expected. That looks good. It looks good. I can't believe this. But what I realized was that the groove I'd routed for the acrylic was now wider than before, and it wasn't even either. That meant that the piece of acrylic that I cut earlier now wouldn't fit. I wasn't too keen on repeating the entire thing again, but in hindsight I would do the bend first and then cut all of the grooves and do the round over after that. That would have worked a lot better. So instead I had a new piece of acrylic cut and I shaped that the best I could to fit the wider groove. Since the groove wasn't even, I had to sand it on my belt sander to get it to fit. It wasn't perfect, but I was kind of hoping to be able to cover up that later. If I had a proper router table, I would probably have gone back at this point and done a new bend, but since I didn't, I wasn't sure how to get around doing the round over handheld when the piece was already bent. Anyways, it wasn't that bad. I then went on to sand the pieces. I also routed a groove on the inside of the other piece that wasn't bent, because the LED will run through the wood and down to get out at the bottom. Then I could fit the LEDs inside the track. The LEDs has an adhesive tape on the back, but I also added some super glue just to make sure it wouldn't move. This tool is one of my favorite additions to my workshop. I don't have space for a full-size compressor at the moment, so I ordered this from Amazon. Looks like a hairdryer, but it comes with a bunch of attachments and it blows air. It's perfect when cleaning the workbench, getting rid of dust from a glue up, or just getting rid of dust from the camera. I'll leave a link down below. I also superglued the acrylic in place and added a bunch of clamps to keep it in place while the glue dried. When all the cables were wired, it was time to glue the 2 pieces together to form the dowel. One of my favorite tools in the workshop is the 3D printer. But if you don't have a 3D printer, you can use the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. They can 3D print whatever you want. You simply upload the model to their website, they quote you, and then they can have it delivered home to you. It's that easy. They also offer PCB prototypes, assemblies, and CNC machining. So check out PCBWay.com, and thanks for sponsoring today's video. Now, to actually get the lamp to stick to the wall, I drew up a simple holder in Fusion 360 and had that cut with the shaper Origin. I just got this tool and I would love to spend all of my days using it. It's fantastic and it was such an investment, but I would really love to do more with it. It was so easy cutting out the shapes that I'd drawn up in CAD, and there's so much more that can be done with it. But that will have to wait. I did sand the dowel a bit with a random orbital sander, but for the most part I did it with hand sanding. Then I decided to finish it with Rubio Monocoat Oil Plus 2C Cotton White. This is a hard wax oil and the white pigment will keep the white tone of the wood rather than give it the yellow look. And I don't like wood that goes yellow. It's very easy to apply and then you wipe off the excess and you're done. And then it was ready to put it on the wall to try it out. All in all, I spent a total of approximately $500 on this project, which is of course way too much for this. And that's not even considering the wood, the tools and the consumables. But it was still worth it because in return I learned a lot of lessons from this. I learned how to bend wood. I now have a steamer that I can use for future bends. I learned a lot about LEDs and I earned myself a new project, the router table. So I would still say it was worth it. Thanks for watching. It's truly appreciated.